The morning air smelled like wet asphalt and honeysuckle, thick with the promise of summer heat that hadn't yet arrived. June 3rd, 1983, a Thursday, dawned pale and humid over the neighborhood of brick row houses and sycamore trees in the Woodhaven section of Queens, New York. By 8:15 in the morning, most fathers had already left for the train stations, briefcases in hand, newspaper sections folded under their arms. Most mothers were clearing breakfast plates from formica tables, stacking them in sinks beneath windows that overlooked small backyards with chain-link fences and vegetable gardens just beginning to sprout. At the Riley house on Maple Court, a narrow street lined with London plane trees whose leaves rustled in the humid breeze, 8-year-old twins Daniel and Joshua Harris were sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, tying the laces of their matching sneakers. White canvas high tops with navy stripes running along the sides and rubber toe caps that had already begun to yellow slightly. Their grandmother, Helen Riley, had bought them the week before from the discount rack at Model Sporting Goods on Jamaica Avenue. 2 pairs for the price of 1. The boys wore them everywhere, to school, to the park, to the corner store, to bed if Helen didn't catch them first and make them take the shoes off before climbing under the covers. Daniel's left shoe already bore a small coffee-colored scuff near the toe, a souvenir from sliding into home base during a pickup game 2 days earlier in the empty lot behind the church. Joshua's was still pristine, because Joshua was careful about everything, methodical in the way he moved through the world, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Helen called from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a floral dish towel that had once been cream-colored, but had faded to grey after years of washing. "Stay on the block. I mean it. Don't go past the corner." The twins nodded in unison, their strawberry blonde hair catching the morning light that streamed through the front window, illuminating dust motes suspended in the air. They bolted out the screen door, which slammed behind them with a sharp crack that echoed down the quiet street, a sound as familiar as breathing in that neighborhood where every house had the same screen door and every mother called out the same warnings. The neighborhood was safe. Everyone knew everyone. Mr. Kowalski 2 houses down would yell if you stepped on his lawn. Mrs. Nguyen on the corner would give you homemade spring rolls if you helped carry her groceries. Kids played stickball in the street until dusk, using manhole covers as bases and calling car whenever headlights appeared. And Mr. Patel at the corner deli would give you a free pretzel from the warmer if you brought back his shopping cart from the parking lot behind the store. Helen watched the boys sprint toward the end of the block where a group of children had already gathered around a chalk hopscotch grid someone had drawn the day before, the numbers still visible despite the rain that had fallen overnight. She turned back inside, drying her hands, and switched on the small transistor radio that sat on the counter near the toaster, its antenna bent at an odd angle but still picking up the local station. The weather forecast hummed through static, partly cloudy. High of 78 degrees. Perfect for the park, she thought. Maybe she'd pack peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices in the cooler and take the boys to Forest Park after lunch, let them run around the playground until they wore themselves out. By noon, the boys hadn't come home. Helen stood on the front stoop, shielding her eyes from the sun with her hand, scanning the street in both directions. The hopscotch grid was empty now, just faded chalk numbers baking in the midday heat. The street was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic on Woodhaven Boulevard and the rhythmic thump of a basketball from somewhere unseen. A flutter of unease passed through her chest, a sensation like cold water trickling down her spine, but she pushed it down. They were probably at the Nguyen house 3 doors down, playing with action figures in the finished basement where it was cool. She walked down the block, her sandals slapping against the hot pavement that radiated heat even through the rubber soles, and knocked on the Nguyen's side door, the one that led directly to the kitchen. Mrs. Nguyen appeared after a moment, holding a dish towel identical to Helen's, printed with the same faded floral pattern. "Haven't seen them since this morning," she said, wiping her hands. They were playing hopscotch around 9, maybe 9:30. Then they ran off toward the corner with some other kids. I thought they went back to your place." Helen's pulse quickened, a drumbeat in her ears that seemed too loud. She moved house to house, knocking on side doors, peering into backyards, calling the boys' names with increasing urgency. She asked neighbors if they'd seen 2 strawberry blonde boys in white sneakers. No one had seen them since mid-morning. Mrs. Rodriguez said she'd seen them running toward the deli around 10. Mr. Patel at the deli said yes, they'd been there, looking at baseball cards in the window display, but they'd left when a customer asked them to move so he could get to the door. That was around 10:30, maybe 11. After that, nothing. By 1 o'clock, Helen was back home, her hands shaking as she dialed the rotary phone, her finger slipping twice before she managed to complete the call. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers in a blue and white patrol car that drew curious stares from neighbors who'd begun to gather on their stoops, sensing something wrong. Officer Vincent DeLuca took notes in a small spiral pad, his handwriting careful and precise, each letter formed deliberately. He was in his mid-30s, with dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes that had seen enough to be skeptical, but not yet enough to be completely cynical. He asked Helen to describe what the boys were wearing, and she recited the details like a prayer. Blue T-shirts with cartoon characters on the front. She couldn't remember which characters, and that detail tormented her later. Denim shorts with elastic waists, both pairs handed down from a cousin's son. Those white sneakers with the navy stripes, the ones she'd bought on sale. She kept repeating details about the shoes, as if the specificity might conjure the boys back, as if enough detail could reverse whatever had happened. Daniel's left shoe had a scuff near the toe. Joshua's was still clean. DeLuca was calm but direct, his voice steady and professional. Any family disputes? Custody issues? Anyone who might have a reason to take them? Helen explained that the boy's mother, her daughter Grace, had died in a car accident on the Long Island Expressway 2 years prior, hit by a drunk driver who'd crossed 3 lanes of traffic on a Tuesday afternoon. The father, Andrew Harris, had struggled with alcohol after Grace's death, unable to hold down jobs, unable to function as a parent. He'd signed over legal guardianship to Helen 6 months after the funeral, recognizing in a moment of clarity that he couldn't care for them. He lived somewhere upstate now, near Albany, working construction jobs when he could find them, when he was sober enough to show up. Minimal contact with the boys. A birthday card in the mail sometimes, weeks late. They were Helen's now, she said. She was all they had, and they were all she had. DeLuca radioed for additional units, speaking in codes Helen didn't understand. Within the hour, a dozen officers were canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on every door, checking garages and sheds, peering into dumpsters behind the grocery store on Atlantic Avenue, interviewing teenagers who hung out near the basketball courts, asking questions, taking notes, looking for witnesses. The search expanded dramatically by evening. Bloodhounds arrived from the K9 unit, German shepherds with serious faces and handlers who spoke to them in German commands. The dogs sniffed the boys' pillowcases, buried their noses in the fabric, and then took off, tracing invisible scent paths through alleyways and across the overpass near the expressway, pulling their handlers behind them. But the trails ended at a curb near the deli, as if the boys had simply vanished into thin air, or more likely into a vehicle. Volunteers from local churches, St. Thomas the Apostle Catholic Church, the Korean Presbyterian congregation on Atlantic Avenue, the Baptist church that met in a converted storefront, assembled at the community center by 6 p.m., organizing into teams with flashlights, photocopied maps, and instructions from the police coordinator. They spread out in a grid pattern, checking parks, playgrounds, construction sites, any place 2 boys might have wandered or been taken. The Queen's Chronicle ran a front-page story the next morning, bumping an article about school budget cuts. Twin boys, 8, vanish from Maple Court. The photograph showed Daniel and Joshua in their school picture from earlier that spring, side by side, shoulders touching, gap-toothed grins, identical except for a small mole on Joshua's right cheek and the way Daniel's hair always stuck up a little on the left side, no matter how much Helen tried to comb it down with water and her own spit. Tip lines were established, phones installed in the precinct basement, volunteers trained to take calls. The FBI's child abduction rapid deployment team arrived on day 3, agents in dark suits carrying metal cases full of equipment, setting up a command post in the precinct's conference room with maps and timelines and photographs pinned to corkboards. Investigators interviewed every registered sex offender within a 5-mile radius, showing up at doors with warrants, demanding alibis and explanations. None had credible alibis that completely eliminated them from suspicion, but none had physical evidence linking them to the boys either. No witnesses placed any of them near Maple Court that day. By the end of the first week, a promising lead emerged, the kind of lead that makes investigators' hearts beat faster and families' hopes soar. A truck driver named Leonard Voss, hauling refrigerated goods up and down the eastern seaboard, reported that he'd seen 2 boys matching the twins' description near a rest stop on the New Jersey Turnpike the afternoon they disappeared. He'd been parked in his rig in the truck section, eating a pastrami sandwich from a cooler and listening to a baseball game on the radio, when he noticed them in the passenger seat of a dark sedan with Pennsylvania plates parked 3 spaces over in the regular vehicle area. The driver was a woman, maybe 40 years old, with short brown hair and oversized sunglasses that covered half her face. Voss thought the boys looked upset, not crying or struggling, but quiet in a way that seemed wrong, too still, staring straight ahead like they were in shock. He thought about saying something, but the woman got back in the car before he could decide, and they drove off. He didn't get the full plate number, but he remembered the first 3 digits because they spelled out a word when you looked at them a certain way. Fun 329 or something like that. He'd meant to call it in right away, but got distracted with his delivery schedule, and by the time he saw the news report 2 days later, he felt terrible. State police issued a bulletin immediately. Hundreds of vehicles were cross-referenced through DMV records in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, every dark sedan with plates starting with those digits. Detectives tracked down 12 vehicles matching the partial description. Each owner was questioned, sometimes multiple times. Each alibi meticulously checked and rechecked. None led anywhere solid. Every lead evaporated under scrutiny. The false positive devastated Helen in a way the initial disappearance almost hadn't, because hope had returned just long enough to be murdered all over again. She'd allowed herself a splinter of hope during those 48 hours between the truck driver's report and the final dead end, imagining the boys found safe in some motel room, confused but unharmed, imagining the sound of the screen door slamming as they ran back inside, imagining their voices calling for her. Instead, silence returned, heavier than before. The quiet in the house became unbearable, oppressive, a physical presence that pressed down on her shoulders and made it hard to breathe. She kept their bedroom exactly as they'd left it, unable to disturb anything. Bunk beds still made with superhero sheets. Spider-Man for Daniel, Batman for Joshua, model airplanes hanging from fishing line taped to the ceiling, a hobby they'd taken up together, spending Saturday mornings at the kitchen table with glue and tiny decals. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle of a pirate ship spread out on the floor between the beds, maybe 200 pieces connected out of 1,000. She couldn't bring herself to vacuum around it. Couldn't bear to disturb those pieces they'd placed with their small hands. Friends from church brought casseroles in foil-covered dishes. Lasagna, baked ziti, chicken casserole, more food than one person could eat. They brought condolence cards with doves and sunsets on the front, though no one was dead, or at least no one knew for sure. The uncertainty was worse than grief, worse than death. Grief had a shape, a process, rituals, and timelines. This was different. This was a kind of spiritual erosion, a slow disappearance of hope that mirrored the boy's own vanishing, an open wound that couldn't heal because it couldn't close. If you're watching this, take a moment and subscribe. It helps us bring more of these stories to light, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Your support means everything as we uncover the cases that time almost forgot. Weeks turned into months, summer into fall. Helen taped missing person flyers to every lamppost within 10 blocks, stapling them to telephone poles with a staple gun she borrowed from Mr. Kowalski, leaving stacks at the deli, the laundromat, the library, any place people might look. She kept a spiral notebook on the kitchen table, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, recording every lead, every phone call, every fragment of information that came through the tip line in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. Most were dead ends, cruel or delusional. Crank calls from people claiming psychic visions. The boys were being held in a barn in Connecticut, or they were on a boat heading to Florida, or they were buried under a bridge in New Jersey. Choose your nightmare. Anonymous tips that led to empty lots and abandoned buildings, where police found nothing but used needles and broken glass. A woman in Newark swore she saw the boys at a traveling carnival in July, absolutely certain, describing them down to their hair color. But when investigators checked the dates and routes, the carnival hadn't been anywhere near Newark when she claimed, hadn't even been in New Jersey that month. By autumn, when the leaves started turning and the air grew cold enough to see your breath in the mornings, media attention had moved on to other tragedies, other missing children, other families destroyed. The news cycle is relentless and has no memory. The detective assigned to the case, Louise Gannon, was a compact woman in her early 40s with short, dark hair she wore in a no-nonsense style, and a reputation among her colleagues for dogged persistence that sometimes bordered on obsession. She visited Helen every other week, updating her even when there was nothing new to report, because she believed families deserved that courtesy, deserved to know someone was still looking. Gannon had 2 sons of her own, 10 and 12, both in Little League and Boy Scouts. She understood viscerally the weight of an empty chair at the dinner table, the hollow echo of a house missing children's voices. Financially, Helen was drowning, barely keeping her head above water. She'd taken unpaid leave from her job as a school secretary at PS 102, where she'd worked for 15 years, spending her days making phone calls to police departments and advocacy organizations, organizing volunteer search efforts, appearing on local news programs to keep the case in the public eye. By winter, when heating bills arrived and snow needed to be shoveled from the walk, her savings were gone, evaporated. She applied for victim assistance funds through the state, filling out forms in triplicate, providing documentation and bank statements. She received a modest grant, enough to cover 2 months of mortgage payments and keep the utilities on through February. Neighbors organized a fundraiser at the church basement. Spaghetti dinner, $5 a plate, with a bake sale table covered in aluminum-wrapped cakes and cookies, and a raffle for a handmade quilt that Mrs. Rodriguez had spent 2 months stitching. They raised $800, mostly in small bills and quarters. It wasn't enough to cover the mounting bills and falling behind mortgage payments, but it was something. It meant people still remembered, still cared, hadn't moved on yet. Helen used part of the money to hire a private investigator named Raymond Katz, a retired NYPD sergeant who'd worked missing persons cases in Brooklyn for 20 years before his knees gave out and he went private. Katz was methodical and slow-moving, with a grey mustache stained yellow from cigarettes and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck. He re-interviewed witnesses, combed through inconsistencies in initial police reports, requested records from surrounding jurisdictions in New Jersey and Connecticut, filed Freedom of Information requests to get files other investigators said didn't exist. He found nothing new, nothing that changed the picture, but his presence reassured Helen that someone was still looking. still treating her grandsons as more than statistics, more than case numbers in a filing cabinet. The first Christmas without the boys was unspeakable, a kind of emotional violence Helen hadn't known existed. She set 2 extra place settings at the dining room table out of habit, her hands moving automatically on Christmas Eve, while her mind was somewhere else. She stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at the empty chairs with their red cushions tied to the backs with ribbons. She thought about the sneakers constantly, obsessively, the white canvas high tops with navy stripes. She'd kept them in a shoebox in her bedroom closet, tucked on the top shelf behind winter sweaters she never wore anymore, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Sometimes late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and the house seemed too quiet and too loud at the same time, she'd open the box and run her thumb over the scuffed toe of Daniel's left shoe, tracing the mark like it was a message in Braille. The only proof she had that they'd been real, that she hadn't imagined them, that they'd existed in the world and left marks on it, however small. The holidays passed in a grey blur of obligatory church services where she couldn't hear the hymns over the sound of her own thoughts, and sympathetic casseroles from neighbours who didn't know what else to offer. January brought snow and a cold snap that lasted 3 weeks, pipes freezing in basements all over the neighbourhood, schools closing for days at a time. Helen returned to work part-time in February, needing the income, needing the structure. Her colleagues were kind, but didn't know what to say, so they said nothing, which was somehow worse than saying the wrong thing. She moved through her days like a shadow, filing paperwork and answering phones, her mind always elsewhere, always scanning faces on the street, always looking. Detective Gannon, meanwhile, continued to build the procedural infrastructure that might one day crack the case open, laying groundwork that might not pay off for years or decades if it paid off at all. She submitted the boys' dental records to the National Crime Information Center database, a centralized system maintained by the FBI that allowed law enforcement agencies across the country to cross-reference missing children with unidentified remains found in rivers, forests, shallow graves in cornfields, decomposed bodies that no one could name. The work was grim but necessary. She also enrolled their case in a new pilot program coordinated by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, an organization that had been founded just months before the boys disappeared, born from the tragedy of other families, other missing children. The program involved age progression imagery, forensic artists who used family photographs, genetic inheritance patterns visible in relatives' faces, and mathematical growth algorithms to predict what a child might look like years later, how bone structure might develop, how features might change. It was experimental, more art than science, but Gannon believed in covering every possible angle, leaving no tool unused. She explained the process to Helen one grey afternoon in March, showing her sketches of what Daniel and Joshua might look like at age 12, at 16, at 21. Helen studied the images carefully, tracing the lines of their faces with her finger, trying to find her grandsons in these strangers' faces. She couldn't reconcile the drawings with her memory of their 8-year-old faces, couldn't connect these projected futures to the boys she remembered. It felt like looking at strangers, at possibilities that might never exist. Years accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer of time and dust. Daniel and Joshua's case remained officially open but practically inactive, filed away in a banker's box that grew dustier with each passing season, pushed further back in the storage room as new cases demanded attention. Gannon retired in 1991 after a minor heart attack that scared her into reconsidering her priorities, and she passed the file to a younger detective named Peter Ruiz, who inherited not just the Harris case, but 24 other cold files stacked in metal filing cabinets. Ruiz was conscientious and dedicated, but overworked, juggling active investigations that demanded his immediate attention, fresh cases with witnesses and evidence and leads still warm. He reviewed the Harris file once a year, usually around the anniversary of the disappearance in early June, and ran routine checks through state and federal databases that grew more sophisticated each year. Nothing ever surfaced. No matches, no hits, nothing. Helen, now in her 60s and then her 70s, had stopped putting up new flyers. The old ones had long since been torn down by weather and time, replaced by advertisements for apartments and lost cats and bands playing at local bars. She still kept the shoebox in her closet, still wrapped in tissue paper. She still set 2 place settings at Christmas, though by this point everyone told her it wasn't healthy, that she needed to let go. But she'd stopped expecting anyone to fill them. Hope had become a kind of muscle memory, an automatic reflex she couldn't quite abandon even though her rational mind knew better. The turn came in 2022, 39 years after the boys vanished into whatever void had swallowed them. A social worker named Karen Diaz was processing intake paperwork for a man named Daniel Callahan, who'd arrived at a transitional housing facility in Albany after spending nearly 3 years living on the streets, sleeping in shelters when beds were available and under bridges when they weren't. Callahan was 47 years old, soft-spoken and guarded in the way people become when they've learned that trust is dangerous. With greying blonde hair that hung past his collar and a nervous habit of picking at his cuticles during conversations, worrying the skin until it bled. During the standard intake interview, conducted in a small office with institutional furniture and fluorescent lights, Diaz asked routine questions designed to build a case file that would help connect him with appropriate services. Where was he born? Did he have family she could contact? Any medical history she should know about? Chronic conditions, medications, allergies? Callahan hesitated, staring at his hands in his lap, picking at a hangnail. "I don't know," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "I don't remember anything before I was about 9, maybe 10. Diaz had encountered trauma-induced amnesia before in her work. Combat veterans, domestic violence survivors, people who'd lived through things so terrible the mind refused to store the memories, building walls to protect itself. But something about Callahan's story nagged at her, wouldn't let go. He mentioned fragmented images that came to him sometimes in dreams or in that liminal space between sleeping and waking, a row of brick houses with iron railings, a hopscotch grid drawn in chalk on dark pavement, a woman who smelled like lavender and dish soap, though he couldn't see her face, and he remembered shoes with absolute clarity, white canvas sneakers with navy stripes running along the sides. Diaz made a note in his file. Childhood amnesia, possible trauma, remembers white sneakers, navy stripes, and moved on to the next intake appointment because there were always more people needing help than hours in the day. But that night, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold, she couldn't stop thinking about the sneakers. It was such a specific detail, vivid and tactile in a way that fragmented trauma memories often weren't, holding a weight that seemed significant. She logged into the New York State Missing Persons database from her home computer, entering her credentials, filtering search parameters for male children who disappeared in the early 1980s. Dozens of cases appeared, screens full of faces that hadn't aged, frozen in time, boys who'd vanished from playgrounds and bus stops and shopping malls, never to be seen again, families still waiting. She narrowed the search by age range and geographic region, focusing on the capital district where Callahan had ended up and downstate areas where he might have originated. When she pulled up the file for Daniel and Joshua Harris, case number 83 MV0421, her breath caught in her throat, held there for several seconds. The photograph showed 2 boys with strawberry blonde hair and gap-toothed smiles, arms slung around each other's shoulders in that unconscious way twins have. One of them had a small mole on his right cheek, visible even in the old photograph. She compared the image to the intake photo she'd taken of Daniel Callahan earlier that day on her phone. The resemblance was striking. The shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, the way the ears sat against the skull, but not definitive. 40 years changed a face beyond easy recognition, added lines and weight and loss. But the possibility was there, hanging in front of her. She contacted the Albany Police Department the next morning before her first appointment, explaining the situation to a detective who sounded skeptical but willing to follow up. Detective Ruiz received the call 3 days later, transferred from Albany PD to his desk at the precinct. He'd been working the Harris case, or maintaining it really, which was more accurate than working, for over 20 years by then, though working was a generous term for what amounted to annual database checks and routine filing. When the Albany detective explained that a potential match had surfaced, that a homeless man in a transitional facility had mentioned white sneakers with navy stripes and fragmented memories of a brick neighborhood somewhere downstate, Ruiz felt a jolt of adrenaline he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades, a physical rush that made his hands shake slightly. He pulled the old case file from storage in the basement, blowing dust off the cardboard lid, releasing the smell of old paper and faded ink. He reviewed everything. The dental records filed in a manila envelope, the age progression sketches from 1984 and then updated in 1995, the witness statements typed on manual typewriters. He coordinated with Albany PD to obtain a DNA sample from Daniel Callahan, explaining the procedure, obtaining consent. And then he drove out to Flushing to visit Helen Riley, who was now 79 years old and living in a senior community with accessible walkways and handrails in every hallway, where someone checked on you daily and meals were provided in a common dining room. Helen agreed immediately to provide a DNA sample for comparison, holding out her arm without hesitation for the cheek swab, though she was afraid to hope after so many years and so many disappointments. She'd been through false positives before. The truck driver's sighting that went nowhere, the carnival lead that evaporated, a dozen other dead ends that had broken her heart in new ways each time. But this time felt different somehow, though she couldn't articulate why. The shoes. He'd described the shoes. The DNA results came back 6 weeks later, processed through the combined DNA index system that cross-referenced genetic markers across local, state, and federal law enforcement databases, comparing 13 core loci that create a unique genetic fingerprint. Daniel Callahan was Daniel Harris. The match was unequivocal, a statistical probability so high, 99.9999%. It left no room for reasonable doubt. Ruiz sat alone in his office at the precinct on a Tuesday afternoon, staring at the report on his computer screen, reading it 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding, trying to process what it meant after nearly 4 decades of nothing. One twin found, alive, after 39 years. But where was Joshua? The question hung in the air, urgent and immediate. He coordinated with Albany PD and made arrangements to drive upstate to interview Daniel himself, to hear his story, to understand how this had happened. They met in a small conference room at the housing facility, white walls marked with scuffs, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a table bolted to the floor for safety reasons. Daniel was wary but cooperative, his hands folded in his lap, eyes darting to the door periodically as if checking his escape route. Ruiz explained gently, carefully, that his real name was Daniel Harris, that he'd been reported missing in June of 1983 from a neighborhood in Queens, and that his grandmother who'd never stopped looking, had been searching for him ever since, for 39 years. Daniel's face went blank, emptied of expression. He didn't remember. Ruiz slid the photograph from the missing person flyer across the table, the paper creased and faded, but the image still clear. Daniel stared at it for a long time, his eyes moving back and forth between the 2 identical boys, trying to find himself. "That's me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ruiz nodded, said yes. That's you." Daniel's hands began to tremble, a fine tremor that spread to his shoulders. "Who's the other boy?" Ruiz explained carefully, choosing his words, that Joshua was his twin brother, his identical twin, and that he'd vanished the same day Daniel had, taken from the same place at the same time. They'd been together initially. Daniel closed his eyes, pressed his palms hard against his temples, as if trying to squeeze memories out. Fragments flickered behind his eyelids like damaged film. A boy who looked exactly like him, a bunk bed with sheets that had pictures on them, the sound of a screen door slamming, the smell of something cooking. But nothing cohesive, nothing that formed a narrative. Trauma had locked the door 40 years ago, and the key was lost somewhere in the decades of survival that followed. Ruiz asked gently if Daniel remembered anything about the day he disappeared, about how he'd ended up in Albany, living under a different name. Daniel shook his head slowly, painfully. "I remember waking up in a basement, cold concrete floor, the kind that hurts your bones. There was a woman standing over me. She said my name was Danny Callahan. She said I'd been very sick, that I'd had a terrible fever and forgotten things, but that I was going to be okay now. She said she was taking care of me. I believed her. I was a kid. What else was I going to do?" The woman, Daniel explained haltingly, had kept him isolated for years, moving frequently between transient apartments and motel rooms across upstate New York, Albany, Schenectady, Troy, Utica, Syracuse, a circuit that never stopped long enough for anyone to ask questions. She homeschooled him using workbooks she bought at thrift stores and yard sales, teaching him reading and math, but nothing else. No history, no science, no connection to any larger world. She never let him play with other children, never let him go to parks or libraries or anywhere he might interact with authority. She told him his parents had died in a car crash, that she was his aunt, his only remaining family, that he had no one else and never would. When he was 19, she died of a stroke in a motel room in Schenectady, collapsing while making coffee one morning. He called 911, but she was already gone. After that, he drifted, unmoored. Odd jobs washing dishes and stocking shelves, always paid under the table, never staying anywhere long. Shelters when he could get a bed, sleeping rough when he couldn't. The cold margins of society where no one asks questions and everyone's trying to be invisible. He'd never thought to question his identity because he'd never had reason to, never had a catalyst that made him wonder. The woman had been his entire world, the only constant in his fractured existence. Ruiz's next question was the hardest, the one he almost didn't want to ask. "Do you remember anything about Joshua, about being with him that day, or before?" Daniel's face crumpled, collapsed in on itself. "I remember a voice, someone who sounded exactly like me. We were in a car, I think, a back seat, and then nothing. Just blank, like someone turned off the lights." Ruiz made detailed notes, his pen scratching across yellow legal paper, documenting everything. The investigators theorized that the twins had been abducted together, but separated shortly afterward, possibly at that rest stop the truck driver had reported seeing back in 1983. Daniel had ended up with the woman, identity still under investigation, dead now and beyond prosecution. But Ruiz was pulling records to find out who she'd been. But Joshua's trail was completely cold, 40 years cold. Ruiz expanded the search immediately, working 18-hour days, running Joshua's DNA profile through every available database he could access. CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that stored DNA from crime scenes and convicted offenders. NMIS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, the DOE network, which catalogued unidentified remains. He requested cooperation from federal agencies, state police in all 50 states, even Interpol, in case the trail had gone international. Weeks passed with no hits, nothing, silence. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late October, when Ruiz was beginning to think Joshua might be dead, might be one of the thousands of unidentified remains buried in potters' fields across the country, a notification appeared in his email inbox. Joshua's DNA matched a man named Eric Landry, currently incarcerated in a federal correctional facility in Canaan, Pennsylvania, serving a 6-year sentence for wire fraud and identity theft. Landry had been arrested 2 years prior for his role in a scheme involving stolen social security numbers and fraudulent credit card applications, part of a larger ring that had operated across multiple states. During routine intake processing at the prison, standard procedure for all federal inmates since the 1990s, his DNA had been collected with a cheek swab and entered into the federal database. The sample had been sitting there for 2 years, unnoticed and unflagged, until Ruiz's query specifically searched for familial matches to Daniel's DNA. Ruiz felt his heart rate spike, felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the cool October air. He contacted the Bureau of Prisons immediately, explaining the situation, requesting an interview. 3 days later, he was sitting across from Joshua Harris in a secure conference room at the prison, cinder block walls painted institutional beige, a single barred window high up near the ceiling, guards stationed outside the door. Joshua, Eric, was 47 years old, thin and angular in his prison uniform, with graying blonde hair he wore pulled back in a short ponytail. The small mole was still visible on his right cheek, exactly where it had been in the photograph from 1983. Ruiz laid the missing person flyer on the metal table between them, his hands shaking slightly. Joshua stared at it, his expression unreadable, cycling through confusion and disbelief. "I don't understand," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. Ruiz explained everything, the whole story, talking for 20 minutes straight. The disappearance in 1983, the massive search that had mobilized a community, the decades Helen had spent looking, never giving up, the fact that his real name was Joshua Harris and that he had a twin brother who'd just been found alive in Albany, that they'd been taken together and separated, that his entire life had been built on a lie. Joshua's reaction was different from Daniel's in fundamental ways. He didn't have complete amnesia. He had memories, fragmented and traumatic, but there. He remembered being at the corner near the deli, he and his brother looking at baseball cards displayed in the window. He could still picture specific cards: a Wade Boggs rookie, a Ryne Sandberg all-star. A man had approached, middle-aged but not old, ordinary-looking with a kind smile, wearing jeans and a polo shirt. Nothing threatening. The man had said he had a whole box of rare cards in his car. If they wanted to see some real valuable ones, they'd followed him. "Stupid," Joshua said, shaking his head, his voice full of self-recrimination 4 decades old. But they were 8. 8-year-olds follow adults. That's what they're taught to do. The man had driven them for what felt like hours, though Joshua couldn't judge time accurately, couldn't say if it was 1 hour or 3. At some point, they'd stopped at a rest area, one of those places on the highway with bathrooms and vending machines and parking lots full of travelers. Another person had been waiting, a woman with short brown hair. There'd been an argument Joshua didn't understand, adults yelling about money and plans and deals that fell through, and then he and Daniel had been separated. He remembered screaming for his brother, fighting, someone's hand clamping over his mouth. Daniel had gone with the woman, put in a different car. Joshua had stayed with the man. The man's name, Joshua said, his voice flat and emotionless in the way people get when talking about trauma, was Gerard Finch. He'd taken Joshua to a house in rural Pennsylvania, miles from anywhere, surrounded by state forest and accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Finch had told him that his family didn't want him anymore, that they'd sold him because they couldn't afford to keep both twins, that he was lucky Finch had agreed to take him. For years, Years that blurred together into an indistinct mass of survival. Joshua had been raised in that house, if you could call it raising. Finch had been controlling and abusive in ways Joshua didn't want to detail, didn't want to put into words. He'd used fear and isolation to keep Joshua compliant, threatened him with things worse than staying if he tried to leave or tell anyone. He'd been homeschooled, if you could call it that. Finch had taught him to read using old textbooks and newspapers, taught him math so he could help with accounting, but mostly he'd taught him how to be invisible, how to not exist in any official capacity. When Joshua turned 18, Finch had given him a set of forged documents, birth certificate, social security card, even a high school transcript, all under the name Eric Landry, and told him to leave and never come back, that their arrangement was over. Joshua had spent the next 3 decades surviving on the edges of legality, taking whatever work he could find, construction jobs, restaurant kitchens, warehouse work, never questioning his identity because Finch had conditioned him to believe his past didn't matter, that it was dead and buried. He'd believed for 29 years that his family had sold him, that he was alone in the world, that he had no past worth remembering. Ruiz felt a cold, focused anger settle in his chest, the kind of anger that's useful to investigators because it sharpens rather than clouds. Gerard Finch had died in 2015 of a heart attack, dying in his sleep in that same isolated house, taking most of his secrets with him beyond the reach of justice. But Ruiz could still piece together a broader picture, could still build a case, even if there'd never be a prosecution. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and requested all available files on Gerard Finch, invoking federal cooperation protocols. What he found was chilling and frustratingly incomplete, full of investigations that had stalled and leads that went nowhere. Finch had been investigated multiple times in the 1980s and 90s for suspected involvement in a black market adoption and child trafficking ring that operated across state lines, moving children from urban areas to rural locations where they disappeared into unofficial custody. The investigations had produced circumstantial evidence, suspicious financial transactions, connections to known traffickers through phone records, reports from social workers about children appearing in his care without proper documentation or legal adoptions, but never enough for criminal charges, never enough evidence to bring to a grand jury. Finch had been careful, methodical. He'd moved frequently, burned connections, knew how to exploit gaps in the system where jurisdictions didn't communicate and databases didn't talk to each other. And he'd slipped through the cracks again and again, protected by incompetence and lack of resources and the reality that missing children from poor neighborhoods didn't get the same attention as missing children from wealthy suburbs. Ruiz hypothesized, building a theory that fit the available evidence, that Daniel and Joshua had been abducted for purposes of illegal adoption or sale, part of a network that sold children to people who wanted kids without going through legal channels, who'd failed home studies or had criminal records or just wanted to avoid scrutiny. But something had gone wrong. The deal had fallen through, or there'd been a dispute between Finch and the woman about payment or arrangements, or the buyers had backed out at the last minute. The twins had been separated and absorbed into different illegal households, their identities systematically erased, their past rewritten, their existence as Daniel and Joshua Harris terminated in every official sense. The reunion was arranged 3 months later, carefully coordinated by the district attorney's office, with extensive input from trauma specialists who worked with trafficking survivors and understood the complexity of these situations. It took place in a neutral location, a community center in Queens, not far from where the boys had disappeared, in a room with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle and soft lighting that didn't feel institutional. Helen Riley was wheeled in by a home health aide, her body frail and failing, but her mind sharp as ever, missing nothing. She was 80 years old now, her hair completely white and thin enough to see her scalp, her hands gnarled with arthritis that made fine motor control difficult. She'd waited nearly 40 years for this moment, had sustained herself on the possibility of it through decades of grief and uncertainty. And now that it was here, she didn't know if she was ready, didn't know if her heart could handle it. Daniel and Joshua entered together, walking side by side without touching. Two middle-aged men who looked nothing like the 8-year-old boys in the photograph, but somehow everything like them. They flanked Helen's wheelchair, standing on either side. Helen looked up at them, her eyes brimming with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks unchecked. "I knew you were alive," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I knew it. Everyone told me to give up, but I knew." The twins knelt beside her chair simultaneously, a mirrored movement they didn't plan, muscle memory from a childhood they couldn't remember. Daniel took her left hand. Joshua took her right. Helen studied their faces desperately, searching for the 8-year-old boys she'd lost 4 decades ago, looking for Daniel and Joshua in these strangers' features. She couldn't find them. They were gone, erased by time and trauma and the lives they'd been forced to live. But she found something else, the men they'd become despite everything, scarred and surviving, shaped by years she hadn't been part of, decades of experience she couldn't imagine. She reached into the large canvas bag, hanging from the arm of her wheelchair, fumbling with the zipper with arthritic hands until the aide helped her. She pulled out a shoebox, the cardboard soft and worn with age, the corners reinforced with yellowed tape. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had turned beige over the decades, were the white canvas sneakers with navy stripes. Daniel's left shoe still bore the coffee-colored scuff near the toe, exactly as it had been that June morning in 1983. Joshua's were still pristine, perfectly preserved, as if waiting for the boy who'd never come home to wear them again. Helen held them out with trembling hands, her voice breaking. "I kept these," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I kept them for you. I told myself that when you came home, I'd give them back to you." Daniel's face crumpled completely, 47 years of buried emotion breaking through the surface all at once. Joshua covered his mouth with both hands, his shoulders shaking, unable to speak. They sat there together on the floor of the community center, the three of them forming a small circle, holding the shoes that had outlasted everything. Grief, time, false hopes, 40 years of absence. The shoes were impossibly small now, children's sizes that could never fit grown men's feet, relics of a childhood that had been stolen and could never be recovered. But they were proof that someone had remembered, proof that they had mattered, proof that love had survived when nothing else could. The legal aftermath proved complicated and painfully slow, tangled in bureaucracy that seemed designed to exhaust people. Daniel and Joshua were both eligible for compensation under New York's crime victim statute, but the application process required documentation that didn't exist and testimony that was difficult to provide after 4 decades. A victims' rights attorney named Rebecca Flores took their case pro bono, recognizing the precedent-setting nature of their situation. She navigated the system on their behalf, filing motions and appeals, arguing before review boards that trauma doesn't respect filing deadlines. The process took nearly 2 years, but eventually both men received compensation packages that included back pay for lost earnings potential, funds for ongoing therapy, and acknowledgement, official legal acknowledgement, that crimes had been committed against them. Both men required extensive psychological support, the kind that couldn't be rushed or simplified. Daniel worked with a therapist named Dr. Patricia Lynn, who specialized in complex trauma and dissociative disorders. Twice a week, they sat in her office working through fragments of memory, trying to integrate decades of false identity with emerging truth. Daniel struggled with profound identity dissonance, unable to reconcile the man named Danny Callahan, who'd lived in his body for 38 years, with the boy named Daniel Harris, who'd disappeared at age 8. Some days he couldn't remember which name was real. Some days both felt like lies. Joshua's therapeutic journey was different, but equally difficult. He worked with Dr. James Okonkwo, who specialized in post-captivity trauma and recovery from long-term abuse. Joshua grappled with anger that felt bottomless, at Gerard Finch, who'd stolen his childhood and died before facing justice, at the system that had failed to find him despite all the searches and databases and technology, at his biological family for not finding him sooner, even though the rational part of his mind knew that wasn't fair. The anger needed somewhere to go, and it took years of work to channel it into something productive rather than destructive. The process of rebuilding a relationship with each other was equally challenging, perhaps more so because there was no guidebook for this, no established protocol for brothers who were strangers. They were twins who shared DNA and a stolen past, but had no common memories, no shared language of childhood, no inside jokes or familiar rhythms. Their first conversations outside the structured reunion environment were awkward and halting, long silences punctuated by false starts and apologies. They tried having dinner together once a month, meeting halfway between Albany and Philadelphia at a diner off Interstate 81. Sometimes the meals went well. Sometimes they sat in uncomfortable silence, searching for topics that didn't hurt. But slowly, in increments so small they were almost invisible, they began to find connection points. They discovered they both hated the taste of cilantro, which made food taste like soap. They both had the same unconscious habit of tapping their left foot rapidly when they were nervous or waiting. They both preferred aisle seats on planes and trains, needing to see exits. They both had nightmares about being trapped in basements. They both bought canvas sneakers exclusively, white ones when possible, though neither had understood why until the reunion. Small things, genetic echoes, and trauma responses. But enough to build on, enough to suggest that underneath everything that had been taken and changed, some core connection remained. Helen lived another 18 months after the reunion, her body failing, but her mind sharp until nearly the end. She died peacefully in her sleep in October of 2023 in a hospice room at the senior community where she'd lived, surrounded by photographs that covered every available surface. The boys, at 8 years old, in the missing person flyer that had hung in police stations for decades. The reunion photo from the community center, all 3 of them crying, and dozens more from the 18 months between, holidays and birthdays celebrated late, making up for lost time, even though lost time can't truly be recovered. Daniel and Joshua spoke at her funeral, standing together at the lectern in St. Thomas the Apostle Catholic Church, where Helen had prayed for their return every single Sunday for 40 years. They talked about resilience, about the woman who'd never stopped searching, who'd kept their shoes in a box for 4 decades, like a sacred trust, who'd refused to let them be forgotten, even when everyone else had moved on. They talked about the power of memory and the weight of absence. They talked about how a single object, a pair of canvas sneakers with navy stripes, could serve as an anchor for hope across an ocean of time. After the service, in consultation with Helen's estate attorney and with their therapist's guidance, they made a decision together. They donated the white sneakers to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Alexandria, Virginia, where they were placed in a permanent exhibit honoring families who'd been reunited after long-term disappearances. The exhibit, which opened in March of 2024, includes a glass case containing the shoes, positioned at eye level so visitors can see Daniel's scuff mark. Beside the case hangs a large photograph of Helen from the 1980s, holding the missing person flyer, her face showing the particular kind of determination that comes from refusing to accept the unacceptable. The plaque reads, Helen Riley, 1943-2023. Grandmother to Daniel and Joshua Harris, she never stopped believing. These shoes waited 40 years for the boys to come home. Daniel and Joshua's case prompted significant policy changes in how New York State handled cold cases involving missing children. The district attorney's office, recognizing the gaps that had allowed the twins to remain lost for so long, established a dedicated cold case task force in January of 2023. The task force, staffed with investigators specifically trained in forensic genealogy and advanced database cross-referencing techniques, systematically re-examined every unsolved child abduction from the 1970s through the 1990s. They entered DNA profiles into modern databases that hadn't existed when the children first disappeared: CODIS, NAMUS, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA. They updated age progression imagery using new software that incorporated machine learning. They cross-referenced dental records, fingerprints collected during elementary school safety programs, and medical records with unidentified persons, incarcerated individuals, homeless services systems, and even international databases. The effort was painstaking and resource-intensive, requiring hundreds of hours and significant funding. But it worked. Within the first 2 years of operation, the task force identified 6 additional cases with potential matches. 2 resulted in confirmed identifications. One involved a woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd been abducted at age 7 in 1987 from a playground in the Bronx. She'd been living under an assumed identity in Portland, Oregon for 35 years, working as a restaurant manager, completely unaware of her true origin until DNA testing revealed the truth. The other was a man named Michael Torres, who disappeared from a playground in Brooklyn in 1991 at age 6. He died in a car accident in Houston, Texas in 2018, but his remains had never been identified or returned to family. Through the task force's work, his mother was finally able to bury her son, 23 years after his death, and 32 years after his disappearance. Detective Peter Ruiz, who retired 6 months after the Harris reunion, now serves as a consultant to the task force on a volunteer basis. He conducts training sessions for law enforcement agencies across the Northeast, teaching investigators how to approach cold cases with fresh eyes and modern tools. He emphasizes the importance of persistence, of checking databases not just once, but repeatedly as new entries are added daily. He tells them about Helen Riley, who never stopped searching even when everyone else had moved on to newer tragedies. And he tells them about white sneakers with navy stripes, and how sometimes the smallest details, the things that seem insignificant at the time of a disappearance, become the threads that eventually lead you home decades later. Today, Daniel Harris works as a peer counselor at a non-profit organization in Albany called Second Chances, which supports survivors of child trafficking and long-term exploitation. He speaks at conferences and training sessions for social workers and law enforcement officers, helping them understand the psychological mechanisms that allow abducted children to disappear into false identities without recognizing what's happened to them, without questioning the reality they've been given. He explains how trauma fractures memory, how captors use isolation and manufactured narratives to rewrite a child's sense of self, how survival often requires accepting whatever reality you're given because questioning it feels too dangerous. His work is difficult, frequently re-traumatizing, forcing him to revisit his own experiences repeatedly. But he finds meaning in it, finds purpose in helping others understand that recovery isn't linear, that you don't simply get over having your identity stolen. You learn to live with the fracture. You learn to integrate the pieces that don't quite fit together. Joshua Harris, after completing his federal sentence for the fraud charges that, given the circumstances of his life and the way he'd been given forged documents as a teenager, many people felt were deeply unjust, enrolled in a community college in Pennsylvania. He's studying social work, focusing specifically on advocacy for prisoners and formerly incarcerated individuals who've experienced childhood trauma. He volunteers with an organization called Fresh Start that helps people obtain identification documents, birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, understanding better than most how the lack of proper paperwork can trap someone in society's margins indefinitely. He and Daniel live in separate states now. Daniel in upstate New York, Joshua in Pennsylvania, but they talk on the phone every Sunday evening without fail. The conversations last anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the week. They're still sometimes awkward, still punctuated by long silences, while both search for words. They're still learning how to be brothers, still navigating the strange terrain of shared DNA and fractured memory. But they're here. They survived. They were found. And after 40 years, that's everything. If you or someone you know is searching for a missing loved one, resources are available that didn't exist even a decade ago. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children operates a 24-hour hotline at 1-800-THE-LOST, staffed by trained counselors who can provide guidance and support. DNA databases like CODIS and NAMUS allow law enforcement to cross-reference missing persons with unidentified individuals across jurisdictions and even across decades. Age progression technology has advanced dramatically, and forensic genealogy, the same techniques used to solve decades-old murder cases, has opened entirely new investigative pathways. Cold case task forces in many states now systematically review unsolved disappearances, applying modern tools to old cases that once seemed hopeless. The Harris brothers' story demonstrates that even decades-old disappearances can yield answers if investigators keep looking and families keep hoping. It proves that families should never stop searching, never stop advocating, never stop demanding that their loved ones matter. And it proves that hope, however improbable it may seem, however many years pass, however many false leads disappoint, is not naive or delusional. It's necessary. It's what keeps cases open when budgets say to close them. It's what keeps people checking databases when logic says no one's coming home. Because sometimes, against odds that seem insurmountable, against time itself, the lost do come home. And when they do, there should be someone waiting with open arms and a pair of shoes kept safe for 40 years, proof that they were never, ever forgotten.